Welcome to the stream. I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin. Sri Lanka's government hopes the International Monetary Fund will soon approve a loan to help lift the country out of its worst economic crisis since independence. But millions of Sri Lankans are struggling with steep tax and price rises that the government says are needed to satisfy IMF creditors. Today, we look at the pressure people are under and ask what's needed to build a better future for all. Joining us for today's discussion in Colombo, we have Harsha Silva. He's an opposition Sri Lankan member of parliament and economist. And Bhavani Fonseca is attorney at law at the Center for Policy Alternatives. And of course, you can join today's conversation. Send us your comments and questions through our live YouTube chat. Let's take a look back at some recent developments in Sri Lanka. First off, for those of you who have not been following this story very closely, well, Sri Lanka's economic challenges deepened in early 2022 with the country mired in debt. People began protesting about shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. Then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa eventually caved to public pressure and fled Sri Lanka in July 2022. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected president by parliament. Within weeks, the government reached a provisional deal for an IMF loan worth $2.9 billion. Now, the release of funds ultimately depends on satisfying the conditions that were set by the creditors there. With that knowledge, which our two guests, of course, know, I mean, this is a story we've been following closely. I want you, if you can, Harsha, to explain for our audience sort of the economic challenges, the pressures people are under, and what's the climate now?
Thanks for inviting me on this show. I mean, in the last few hours, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund tweeted that since Sri Lanka has now got financial assurances from all its creditor countries, including China, that she's now looking forward to taking the Sri Lanka matter up at the executive board on the 20th. Which means this is the best news the government could have had since this trouble started, and they went to the IMF in around August of last year. So which means light at the end of the tunnel from an economics perspective, and so it's really good news. That will clearly change the course of the economy. And
Bhavita obviously outlining this signal from Kristalina now that China has guaranteed kind of the loan. It seems as though things are going to be moving forward. We can talk about that a little later, but what is it like for people on the ground there? I know you're a human rights lawyer. I mean, could you just paint a picture for us of how bad things are, and not just in the economic sense?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. The situation has been rather grave the last couple of months and over a year. And the fact that people are facing dire straits, the World Food Program has said over 30% of families are food insecure. People are skipping meals. Malnutrition is on the rise. I mean, we may not have the long queues we saw in 2022 that led to the big protest last year, but people are struggling. So that is something we need to recognize. So in a way, what's happened today with the potential good news with the IMF package, hopefully actually has a direct impact on the people who are suffering. So, the question though is how long will it take for people to actually see tangible change? So while we talk at the macro level, there are things moving for people, for the daily struggles. That's going to take a longer time for people to actually experience that.
No, and I appreciate you kind of highlighting that, because that's the reality on the ground for the people who have been protesting and who feel as though their grievances maybe aren't being heard or addressed by the government. With that in mind, I do want to just hear from them directly. Here's a video that was filed a few weeks ago by my colleague Minel about a fisherman who's struggling with daily life in rural Sri Lanka. Take a listen.
For more than 40 years, fishing has been a way of life for Arulanandan Geetha Pongalan. Today, he's struggling to survive.
The price of fuel is too high. It was 70 rupees a liter. Now it's more than 4 times that. The price of nets have also gone up and they don't last as long. Things are very difficult.
Fishermen across the country are facing the same struggle. If they don't land a proper catch, they can't cover their costs. Debts are mounting. Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis in memory left the country bankrupt, unable to pay for basic essentials like food, medicine and fuel.
So when you see this video, Harsha, what are the opposition parties trying to do and edge in here? I mean, in the absence of the IMF loan, it seems like that's being framed as the only solution. But for these fishermen, I mean, how does that help them feed their children?
Well, actually, we need to sort of understand what the issue really is. We are not only facing a liquidity crisis, but a crisis of solvency. In that it's not just a billion or $2 US dollars we need to get back on our feet, but a complete overhaul of the economic structure. Now, we saw that fisherman there, and he said that the price of fuel went up by 4 times. That is true. Now, the reason for that is fuel needs to be priced to reflect its cost. Now, when you do that, it is certainly going to have a big impact on some people, particularly the low income. Now, the challenge for the government is how do they identify these people and how do they ensure that they are taken care of. So the issue is not giving fuel at 70 rupees a liter for everyone, including the rich people, but restructuring the subsidy scheme. So this is something that had to happen over a period of time, but didn't. So immaterial of my being an opposition politician, I have to admit that unless we do these changes, that we cannot get out of our solvency problem.
Bhavita, go ahead, jump in there.
So can I just say this crisis, I mean, we're seeing it in 2022 now, the protests, all of that, it's a governance crisis. It's the fact that just getting an IMF bailout is not going to solve these problems. So we have deep structural inequalities and reforms are necessary, but what is it going to be, how is it going to be different? And these are some very fundamental questions we need to address. So can the government at this moment, with the present crisis, getting the IMF bailout, if it actually comes through, what is going to be different is going to be the big question that we need to all address, because otherwise it might be the 17th bailout, but does it really make a difference? And are we going to repeat the same mistakes?
Well, I'm not an economic expert, and that's why you're here, Harsha, in part, but that seems like a very commonsensical place for a person's brain to go. I mean, it's happened 16 times. This would be the 17th time. What makes this different is, I think, a rhetorical question that's guiding this conversation. But I want to ask you, I mean, it seems like Sri Lankan households, it's no longer about simply having less meals, perhaps, trying to cut costs, but there are some basic food items that just simply they can't afford. We know that adults are skipping meals in order to feed their children. Half of households, the children's food intake is so much less. I mean, when they're in such dire straits, and then you see the government, for example, postponing local elections, does that instill sort of faith in the citizens who have been protesting for more than a year now?
Yeah.
Why was it postponed? Could we just, I think I threw a lot of things at you there, but why were the elections postponed?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, elections were postponed because the government has no chance of winning the election. And as long as they think that they cannot win the election, it will get postponed. But we are going to fight for it. Our political party went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court now said that the government, really the Treasury, cannot any longer hold back funds for the election. And just last night, the Elections Commission said that by the 25th of April, that we should attempt to hold this election. But coming back to Bhavani's point of view, it is absolutely correct. And it's a governance issue. And why we got to this point is because, we didn't fix that. Now, to your point, Ahmed, about why 16 times and why is it going to be different this time? There's something that is really different this time. And that is, this is the first time we've gone to the IMF as a bankrupt nation. In that, we had to, in the previous occasions, just deal with the IMF. And then on many of the loans that we had agreed to in the past, we just, reneged on them, and halfway we said we are no longer going to keep to the conditions that we originally agreed on. But this time around, we got third parties. We got the bilateral creditors like China and India and the Paris Club on the one hand, who now tied us down to a program that was basically agreed with the IMF based on what's called a debt sustainability analysis. And then on the other hand, we got all these private creditors who've bought into about $15 billion worth of international sovereign bonds, with whom we haven't even started discussions yet. So just because the IMF says, look, we are going to start releasing money, hopefully in a few weeks' time, only now we will start discussing.
Bhavani looks like she wants to get in. I appreciate you raising these points. Bhavani, go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, end of the day, I think we need to be very mindful of what's happening on the ground. The crisis is such that, as you mentioned, the figures are there, the people are suffering. There is also this worry, while the government is now saying, yes, the IMF package, I mean, the narrative that is being created, that's important. We have to go through this. But there is a very, very fundamental problem here when the government is doing everything possible to undermine democratic processes. Harsha raised the whole issue of the postponement of local government elections. Now, that's a fundamental element in democracy. When a government is undermining that in the name of an economic crisis, that they're bankrupt, that's very, very worrying. We need to unpack that. But the other point I think is very important is the repression. Today we had protests in Colombo. We're seeing protests every day. That's a sign of unhappiness from people. But the force that is being used on people is also extremely worrying, the violence that is being used. So there are multiple challenges in Sri Lanka, and just the government saying we've got this IMF package is not going to solve all the problems.
Yeah, and I think because it keeps coming back to the IMF package, which is the government's narrative of, preparing the people that this is the solution, this is the only solution. I mean, to me, it's certainly these questions you're raising. It's like the government and the bureaucracy have embraced with sort of this shameless enthusiasm this idea of neoliberal economic reforms, which are hoping to manage a crisis that in a way was started by some of those same sort of reforms. It seems like there's a cycle, that Sri Lanka is in a cycle. And so let's hear from some trade union leaders. This is from March 1st, and it's basically a strike action, yet another one by the unions that are opposed to the IMF conditions specifically. Take a listen.
We are not in a position that we can't pay tax. We are in a position we want to pay tax, but in a reasonable amount. This amount is not reasonable. That's why we are telling government should amend this tax policy. Otherwise, we will go for another strike or another major action, maybe a continuous strike.
So thousands of union workers joined these strikes, as you know, spending cuts demanded by the IMF creditors, things that they don't like. Harsha, it looked like you wanted to say something about this.
Yes, now I did say that we need to go through with the IMF program, and that is correct. But I do agree with the gentleman that just spoke that we need to relook at one of the main issues, that is in terms of taxes. What has happened is we've increased the marginal tax rate to 36% of income very quickly, which means that professionals and others are really getting squeezed because prices have more than doubled, but incomes have stayed the same. So
Right.
cost of living has become really difficult.
And frankly, the prices have not just more than doubled. In some cases, it's 5 times what they were just not so long ago. I mean, I guess what I'm asking, if you look at that clip that we just played, and we know that, of course, that protest, that strike was in defiance of the president's executive order. I mean, this is the sort of oppression or repression that I think you're talking about. Why is that so part and parcel with any solution from the IMF or from other bilateral, agreements? Why is it important for the government to also address what's happening in the streets and to curtail some of the repression?
I mean, if I may, I mean, I was in one of those protests not 10 days ago, and I was tear gassed, and I myself personally had to suffer through, and that is because we protested for our democratic right to have the elections on time, because there needs to be an outlet. Okay, I mean, the outlet need not be fighting on the street, but democratically, we have to have the vote to express anger for most people, right? And this is only a local government election, not something that changes the government. So now that the government has the money, there is no way they can continue to say they don't have the money to have elections. That excuse is no longer valid. So therefore, there is absolutely no more excuses that the government can give to postpone the election. So I'm going to assume that we will have the elections before too long.
But if I may just interject, Bhavani, your face is suggesting to me that you don't have a lot of faith in the government's ability to do some of those things that he was just outlining. And I'm curious, if these economic hardships continue, if we keep seeing the repression, won't we continue to see more and more protests if it's going to take a long time, as you mentioned, for the IMF impacts to come through?
Yeah, I think the protests are going to continue regardless. I mean, people, as I mentioned at the outset, people need to see tangible change, and that's going to take a while. But that said, I mean, one of the failures of this government is that they're not speaking to the people. They're speaking to a particular elite or their own circles. They need to communicate and connect with the citizen. I go back to what happened last year, where the citizens really came out to the streets. There was anger. There were calls for system change. 1 year on, the question is, has that system change happened? That hasn't happened. So what the worrying thing is, the government is pushing out a particular narrative, but that narrative doesn't take note of the grievances of the general public.
Yeah.
And that's the worry, that if this disconnect continues, there's going to be more and more protests. But then the worry is, what kind of repression are we going to see in response to that protest?
Right, and we've already had a glance of what that might look like from the last sort of rounds of those protests really erupting. Because you talked about the government's failure to communicate, let's actually see what the president himself had to say about the solution in the form of the IMF coming soon. Take a look at what the president had to say.
We expect the IMF to fulfill their commitment and grant approval for the programme either in the 3rd or 4th week of March. After that, I think we will get the first round of financing from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. If we break the agreement with the IMF, we will have to repay the loans we took from foreign countries and private banks. We will have to pay 6 to 7 billion annually until 2029. We don't have foreign exchange to pay these loans.
So I'm just curious, Bhavani, what is the alternative to these loans? I mean, what about debt cancellation? Is that another solution? Is it realistic? Is it not?
Well, there are different conversations happening, and I think this is the important thing: is we look at the different alternatives. What are like debt cancellation? All of those things are important conversation to happen, but the main point is that the government seems to be, and the president in particular, seems to be pushing a one particular narrative and not taking note of other issues that the people are facing. So this is, while we talk about IMF, debt cancellation, all of these things, ODS debt, all of this, important thing is for the government to connect with the people. And for that to happen, that the space need to be there as well. And the problem is, it seems to be a very one-sided narrative that doesn't seem to be taking note of all the hardships people are facing. That said, if the elections happen, that is the first outlet the people will have. So let's hope the democratic processes are able to go through now without executive action trying to stop that.
And Harsha, if I can, I know you wanted to jump in, but before you do, I wanted to share with our audience, you were with us back in March of 2022 here at the stream, and you had some very telling things to say then. I'd love to get your feedback on them now, based on where we are now. So take a look at what you had to say to us here on the stream in March last year.
This could have been avoided. This need not have happened. In fact, I made a long speech as the opening speaker for the opposition when the 2021 budget was presented in November of 2020, and I urged the government to seek the support of the IMF. Because what we currently have is a toxic combination of a debt overhang and a liquidity crisis.
So I'm wondering, when you listen to that, you know, and knowing where we are right now, I mean, is debt forgiveness going to be part of this plan? I'm not setting you up to say I told you so or to tell the government you told them so, but is debt forgiveness a viable route in your mind?
It is going to be very difficult to seek debt forgiveness, particularly because this debt was taken by us on the promise that we were going to use it for various development purposes. And it was a democratically elected government that did that. I mean, yes, there have been instances in the past about, how debt.
Harsha, I want to share with you, sorry, forgive me, on YouTube, people bringing up an angle that you wanted to talk about before we wrap here, just the geopolitical nature of all this between China and India. Technical Sanula saying China will also ask for money that they give with massive interests. And a lot of people bringing up India. Does that, you think, factor into the lack of options other than the IMF loan?
No, I don't think so. In this case, it is India and China who are largest bilateral creditors. Now, the issue that most other countries seem to be having, whether it is Suriname, Zambia, Chad, or Ethiopia, is that they've not been able to unlock the China solution. Now, this does not mean what we heard from the IMF, does not mean that everything is hunky-dory and everything is fine from now on. It's just that, from what we understand, the Chinese have agreed to something similar to what the Indians have agreed, right? Now, it is up to the government to implement what they have promised. And if they don't, at the 6 months tranche, it may not continue. The program may fail. And it has failed multiple times, like I said in the past. So there, what Bhavani is saying is critically important, and that if the government is unable to listen to the people, and as opposition parties, while we support Sri Lanka, don't get me wrong, we are supporting Sri Lanka, right?
Yeah.
And we are bringing to the notice of the government the suffering of the people.
So forgive me, Harsha, for interrupting you. I know you're making an impassioned plea here, and you're agreeing with Bhavani, but this is all the time we have really left for this conversation on this show. I do want to thank you for for joining us. And I also want to mention, I think it's worth saying that we invited the ruling United National Party, of course, to join us for their point of view, but unfortunately, we didn't get a reply. So that's all the time we have for today for this show, but you can always find us online at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching.